Hey guys, so today we're going to continue our look at absolutism by talking a little bit about what was going on in England. So England is kind of a different situation from the rest of Europe at this time period, because while we do start with an absolute monarchy in England, we are going to see there be a really big shift in the 100 years that the Stewart Dynasty is in power in England. So that's what we're going to kind of get to see today. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. So we left off in England in 1601 when England begins kind of their correspondence with King James VI of Scotland. So basically Elizabeth's not doing so well. She's in her 60s at this point. People kind of know that she's probably not going to live very long. Obviously she has no children. And so they're starting to wonder who's going to be the heir. James VI seems like he's going to be the natural heir. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was in line behind Elizabeth before she was executed. He was named the King of Scotland in 1567 when he was only 13 months old, and has pretty much ruled ever since then. So he's a young man at this point, and he seems like the best and most obvious option. So in 1603, when Elizabeth dies, James is named as her heir, and he becomes James VI of Scotland and James I of England. And this, for the first time, unifies England and Ireland and Scotland, at least in name. They're not really going to be completely unified as a nation yet, but in name, at the very least, they are going to be unified. So let's talk a little bit about James. So really, when James comes to the throne, the people of England are not quite sure what to expect, but whatever they did expect, James wasn't really going to be what they thought he was going to be. So the first thing is, James is a firm believer in the divine right of kings, or the fact that God gives you the right to rule. This quote here says, "Kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit on God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods." So think about what that's saying, this idea that even we are not just God's representative, we are basically many gods here on earth. And that's really going to determine how he rules, because you can't really argue with like, well, God told me to do it, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that James inherited massive debt that comes under Queen Elizabeth. Now, people aren't really willing to admit that this is something he inherited. It's really something more that they're going to try and put the blame on him for. But the big problem is that James is not supposed to be able to collect taxes without the approval of Parliament. That is one of the checks on kings that the English Parliament has. However, he finds a loophole through these customs duties or taxes on imported goods that were called impositions, and he was able to kind of like find a loophole to get them to pass without Parliament. And that's really going to begin kind of this conflict between the king and Parliament that's going to be a big deal. The other big thing that we've got going on in England at this time is a Puritan movement. So the Puritans are kind of like the extreme side of the Protestant church. They basically believe that the Church of England needs to be purified, which is where that they get that name from. And the Puritans are really hoping that Parliament is going to take the step in order to do that. However, James really opposes them and believes that the church and the monarchy are very much linked. So by basically the Puritans saying there's corruption in the church, he's also saying, well, you must think that there's corruption with me. So there's some things that the Puritans want to do. They want to get rid of the bishops. Well, James is not in that. He says if there are no bishops, there are no kings, right? So we can't do that. They want to clean it up a little bit. They want to make it look less like a Catholic church. Remember, the Church of England looks a lot like the Catholic Church in the rituals and rites that they do, and they really want to do that, or clean that up. But James is not into it. This is when a lot of religious dissenters, such as the Pilgrims, start to leave England, as Puritans are finding that it's harder to be welcome there. And this is going to lead to some increased tension between the king and Parliament, as many members of Parliament actually are Puritans. Finally, in 1604, James signs a peace with Spain, and also this is about the same time that the 30 Years' War is going on in Europe. So between a peace with Spain, who is a major Catholic country, and the fact that James is really not willing to step up during the 30 Years' War, this starts to make people in England really feel like James is pro-Catholic. And between all the back and forth that was going on between Protestant and Catholicism in England, by 1604, Catholics are not popular in England at all. And so anytime the king starts to look a little pro-Catholic, that's going to make him a little bit uncomfortable, or make the people of England a little bit uncomfortable. And then, of course, we have a scandal. So there is a guy named George Villiers, who is the Duke of Buckingham, and he and James were pretty much best friends. And some thought that they might even be a little bit too close, if you understand what I'm saying. So George Villiers controlled patronage in the British government. So basically people that he liked were able to get power. And he was seen as having a little bit too much power over the king. And this is not something that the people of England were crazy about. And this is going to become really important too, as George Duke of Buckingham doesn't go anywhere. He's going to be somebody that's around for a long time. And people don't like seeing that one man has too much influence over the king, especially when there might be a little bit more going on that people aren't really crazy about. So James himself is not super popular, and one of the ways that this comes out is that actually in the mid-1600s there is a plot to kill James while he is in Parliament. This is known as the Gunpowder Plot, and it was led by a team of pro-Catholics, actually. And basically, one side thought he wasn't Catholic enough, the other side thought that he was not, or one side thought he was too Catholic, the other side thought he wasn't Catholic enough. So a group of men, one of whom was named Guy Fawkes, planned to blow up the Parliament building by putting gunpowder in a basement underneath the Parliament. This actually was discovered before it could happen and was found out. The men were arrested and executed. But this is where we get the phrase, remember, remember the 5th of November, which was made popular by the movie V for Vendetta. That all goes back to gunpowder, treason, and plot, right here with Guy Fawkes. So when James dies, he kind of leaves England in a little bit of a shaky spot. And when he dies in 1625, his son Charles takes the throne. Now, if people weren't really sure what to do with James, when Charles comes to the throne, people are pretty much instantly not crazy about him. First of all, he inherits all of the problems that his dad had had with Parliament, all of the issues, the back and forth with Parliament. He inherits that. He also happens to inherit all of his dad's belief about absolute monarchy and divine right of kings, and basically believes that he should be the one being able to tell Parliament what to do. He marries a woman named Henrietta Maria. She is the French sister of Louis XIII. So not only is she French, she is also Catholic. And the English, if there's two things they hate the most, it is the French and the Catholics. So automatically the French people are not crazy about his wife, especially when you consider the fact that their children are probably going to be raised Catholic, and they do not want a Catholic monarch on the throne. He is also a little too fond of Daddy's best friend Buckingham. So you remember old George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham? Well, it turns out that if James and Buckingham were a little too close, Charles and Buckingham were definitely too close. And there was definitely rumors going around that they were a little bit more than friends, and they were probably lovers. And the people of England were just not crazy about this idea. And so pretty much the summary of Charles's reign is this continuous back and forth between Parliament and the king. So basically the way that this goes is whenever war breaks out or whenever Charles needs money, he has to call Parliament into session to ask for money. Now, he can choose when to call and when to dismiss Parliament. That is his right as king. But basically, he only wants them around when he needs the cash, right? Well, Parliament, as you can imagine, they're not crazy about this idea. So when he calls to ask for money, Parliament's like, oh, no, man, we're not going to give you that cash unless you give us this power. So, like, we'll give you the money if you will do this, this, and this. Well, of course, Charles is not going to be crazy about that idea. So as soon as they refuse money, Charles is going to dissolve them and say, fine, go back home. Now, this actually happens on 4 separate occasions while Charles is king. And basically his hands are tied by the fact that he needs the money and Parliament is not willing to give it to him. So for about the first 20 years of his reign, it's this continual back and forth, and there's actually a period of 11 years where Parliament is not even called at all. So imagine, in our country, if Congress were not around for 11 years, that would be the same kind of thing. And so this is a pretty big issue here in Britain at the time. So this really comes to a head when Parliament decides that they need to get something out of this with Charles. So in 1628, Parliament is called when Charles needs some taxes and is asked for taxes. And Parliament's like, you know what, man, sure, we'll give you the money, but you have to sign this document first. And this document was known as the Petition of Right. And basically what it said is you have got to stop abusing your kingly power, right? You can't tax us. You can't tax the people of England without Parliament's consent. So although that's been something that had been on the books, they're just confirming it. You can't imprison subjects without just cause. This is known as habeas corpus. So you can't just arrest people. You have to, try them with something. They have to know what their charges are. And this is a basic civil right. You can't just quarter soldiers in people's homes. So quartering soldiers basically means that the soldiers move into your house because the government said that that has to happen. Well, you can't just do that without the consent of the subjects. So basically what this document is doing is asking for some basic civil rights for the people of England. And Charles is like, he's not crazy about it, but he really needs the cash. Like, he's at war with the Dutch and he's strapped for the cash. So he really needs the cash. So he's like, you know what? Fine, I'll do it, right? As soon as he does, he gets the money, and wouldn't you know it, you're out, Parliament, right? Well, when Parliament's not there to enforce the Petition of Right, he doesn't have to follow it, right? So Parliament is getting really pissed, as you can imagine, because basically they're just trying to protect the rights of the people of England, and they really see that Charles is abusing his power as king, and that's not something that the English are really okay with. So this is what I was talking about, where there's going to be an 11-year period after this where Parliament is not even in the picture. However, at the end of that 11 years, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that war is coming. So the Puritans in Parliament have some beef. So they're angry at Charles for trying to make them a little too Anglican, right? And in fact, there is a rebellion in Scotland. This is, people kind of say that maybe the English Civil War actually began in Scotland. So a church in Scotland basically gets together and says, you know what? If you are going to make us try to become Anglican, we're going to invade you guys. So the Scottish church threatens to invade. And in order for Charles to be able to put up a fight, he's got to get the money and the power from Parliament, right? So he calls Parliament. Again, they attempt to be like, hey man, we'll give you the money, but you've got to sign this right. Yeah, they're trying to limit his power. And Charles is not putting up with it anymore. He's done. So in January of 1642, Charles tries to arrest some of the leaders of Parliament, but luckily they were tipped off ahead of time and managed to get away. But think about what this is, right? This is the king marching into the legislative building, arresting the people, the leaders of Parliament, because they're not doing what the king wants them to do, right? They're not rolling over and saying, yeah, we're going to follow whatever you tell us. This basically looks like a major abuse of power, and the people of England are not having it. And it makes especially worse when Charles there's actually a mob that gathers outside of the palace, and Charles is forced to flee. And when he does, he's like, dude, I gotta get an army, I gotta put this together. So he decides to raise an army of Irish Catholics. Now again, if there's one thing the English don't like at this point, it is Catholics. And even though Ireland is technically part of the United Kingdom, they're not too crazy about the Irish either. So this basically looks like a foreign Catholic army that Charles is going to use against the Puritan English. And this makes them angry. The people of England are not willing to put up with this. And so this is going to break out as the English Civil War. So the English Civil War begins in that year in 1642 and lasts until 1651. Charles I's supporters are known as the Royalists because they are royal, right? The crown, they're loyal to the crown. They are also nicknamed the Cavaliers because if you kind of think about like the old Three Musketeers movies, the idea of like this dashing 17th century knight kind of thing, that's where they get their name from. Imagine, you know, men with the long curly hair and that sort of idea on horseback. That's where these guys get their name from. And then Parliament supporters, who are mostly Puritans, are also known as the Roundheads. And that's because Puritans at the time tended to cut their hair very short. The fashion of the day was for men to wear long hair or to wear wigs that had long hair. And Parliament basically, the Puritans wanted to show kind of, they didn't want to have this excess of luxury. So one of the things they do was they would cut their hair really short. Now today, most men wear their hair short anyway. But at the time, it was considered kind of funny for men to have their hair short because it showed their round heads. And so that's where they get their nickname. It's definitely meant to be a derogative nickname. They also are called parliamentarians because they support Parliament, right? Their major leader is a guy named John Pym who kind of starts the whole thing. He was actually one of the men that was attempted to be arrested in Parliament. And their lead general is a guy named Oliver Cromwell. Now, without this war, Oliver Cromwell would probably have just died a minor nobleman and nobody would have ever heard of him. However, after several years of war, it really becomes clear that Parliament's not doing too good. They're not organized as well. So Oliver Cromwell comes in as a general and starts to train the army. And this is known as the New Model Army. And the idea is that this is the new model for what armies all around the world should look like. So he, gives them better weapons, he gives them better training, and by 1647, Parliament is back on top, and in fact, Charles I is taken prisoner. In 1649, so in the 2 years that they have Charles prisoner, they've got to kind of decide what to do with him, right? So at first, they're willing to say, look, man, we'll let you be king again if you're willing to limit your power. If you want to be a constitutional monarch, so a monarch that sticks to a constitution with power limited by the government, we are totally cool with that. We will let you reign. But Charles is so entrenched in this belief that he was approved by God and that he has absolute right. There is no way that he is going to do this. And so after 2 years of going back and forth, basically they can't get around it anymore. And Charles in 1649 is brought to trial for the charges of treason against Parliament. And he is beheaded in London. And this is a huge deal because this is the king that is being executed by his own government, right? And this is a dramatic change to the concept of absolute monarchy throughout Europe because basically what this says is the king himself is not the state. And he is not the state because he was subject to the laws of the state. He is not above the law. And that's huge, right? So what we're going to see here with the English Civil War is the beginning of this constitutional monarch in England. Now, Charles' son, who is also named Charles, of course, does actually try to go against Cromwell, but he is defeated by the New Model Army, and he lives in exile in Europe until 1660. So at the end of this, Oliver Cromwell really comes out on top. And he is going to lead a period in English history known as the Interregnum, which is basically this period where the Stuarts were out of power in England. And this is a really big change in British history because this is going to be a time where there is no king in power in Europe. So Oliver Cromwell takes control. He becomes what's called Lord Protector, and he dismisses Parliament. He dismisses Parliament as kind of a way to kind of get things back on track and they write up a new constitution. They make England technically a republic, which is what the Dutch are doing at the same time. And it looks like this very democratic change in English history. However, was it really? Because remember, Oliver Cromwell was a general, and he divides the country up into military districts. At one point, he's so frustrated with the new constitution that he actually rips it up in the middle of Parliament, right? Now, he refuses to take the crown, but do you have to be a king to be a dictator? Not really. And a lot of people will say that this is a 10-year period where England was actually ruled by a military dictator. So this is just a picture of Charles refusing the crown. I cannot undertake this government with the title of king, and that is my answer to this great and weighty business. So I'm not going to be king, right? But, you know, taking total control, that's not a bad thing, right? So as a Puritan, Cromwell really believes that he has to try and purify Puritan or English society. And the way to do this is by basically trying to ban all simple activities under the court of law. So things like brothels, yeah, you know, that makes sense, totally. Ale houses, yeah, you don't want people getting drunk and stumbling out into the street, totally, get it. Cursing, well, you know, it's vulgar, right? Theater, okay. Dancing, well, I guess you don't want men and women to get too touchy. Sports? Basically, Oliver Cromwell outlaws fun, right? And this is really something that the English people are not crazy about. He does establish some religious toleration. Now, any branch of Protestantism was tolerated, but Catholics were not. Oliver Cromwell hated Catholics, so Catholicism was not tolerated in England under Oliver Cromwell. But Judaism was. Jews had been expelled from England in 1290, so during the Middle Ages, and basically it had been illegal for Jews to live in England from that time. And Cromwell says, you know what? These guys are pretty good with money. We should probably let them back in. And so Oliver Cromwell allows Jews to return to England and kind of gives them a safe haven that they had not been able to experience in England since the Middle Ages. So this is how Cromwell handles society. Let's look at how he handles foreign policy. So remember, as I said before, Ireland was technically part of the United Kingdom or Great Britain. They had colonized Ireland under the reign of Henry II in the Middle Ages, and basically they'd ruled over Ireland for about 500 years. However, the Irish were not crazy about being controlled by the English, and there were continually uprisings against the foreign rule of the English. The English themselves were not crazy about the fact that the Irish refused to convert from Catholicism to Anglicanism. And they were not crazy about the Puritan reforms, as you can imagine, because they're Catholic. They want to answer to the Pope, right? And so that's really important to the Irish, but the English are not happy about it. And Cromwell himself, as were most Puritans, were extremely anti-Catholic. And so when it came to his dealing with Ireland, he was not going to be merciful to them at all. So a group of Irishmen led a rebellion against Oliver Cromwell in an attempt to fight back against some of these Puritan reforms. And in 1649, Cromwell sends his new model army which lands in Dublin. And from there, the army basically marches in and ravishes the countryside. Fighting was bitter, it was violent. He would attack civilians, men, women, and children were all brutalized. And I mean, there was some terrible stuff going on. There are pictures of like babies being stabbed on the end of pitchforks, women being raped. I mean, it was a terrible period. But the worst part probably for the Irish people was that the Irish civilians were basically kicked off of their own land, and their food supplies were completely destroyed. So basically their crops were burned. So it sparks this huge famine and leads to a period of economic decline in Ireland. But what happens in 1652 is Cromwell passes what's called the Act of Settlement, which basically encourages English people to move to Ireland. So because his forces were victorious in the Irish Rebellion, obviously, all Catholic land, so land owned by the native Irish people, was confiscated and given to English landlords. So about 12,000 soldiers that went with Cromwell to Ireland were paid not in money, but in the land confiscated from the Irish people. So essentially what happens is the Irish people are now renters of their own land. The Catholic landowning class is completely destroyed in Ireland. The Irish basically were forced to work as tenant farmers on lands that their family had lived on, sometimes for hundreds of years. So it would basically be if the government walked into your house and said, sorry, this is not your house anymore. This belongs to my friend over here. But if you want to keep living here, you have to pay this guy rent, right? That's crazy. But really what this did is it solidified that the Irish were going to be economically depressed for quite some time. When you look at this map here, so the 1641 map shows how much land was owned by the Catholics in Ireland prior to Cromwell getting there. So you can see that most of the country is land owned by Catholics. After Cromwell, after the Act of Settlement, if you look, 0 to 24% of the land is owned by Catholics. I mean, crazy ridiculous. Now keep in mind, the people didn't go anywhere. They're just now paying rent to live on their own land. And this was a huge effect. In fact, in Ireland today, Oliver Cromwell is still a dirty word. You don't mention Oliver Cromwell to Irish people. So Oliver Cromwell dies in 1658, and his son Richard briefly takes control of the Commonwealth after his rule. However, Richard is not nearly as good of a leader as his dad was. He could not hold power. He could not hold his own. And by 1660, basically, Parliament was like, you know what? Really, we'd rather just go back to a monarchy. So Richard Cromwell is actually sent away. He goes on to become a strawberry farmer, of all things. And they invite Charles I's son, Charles II, to become king. So you remember, he had been living in exile in Europe. But in 1660, they were basically like, hey man, our bad. We're sorry about the whole killing your dad thing. It would be super cool if you could come be our king again, right? So, yeah, that's great. But Charles II is happy to do it. He's actually nicknamed the Merry Monarch because after this 10-year period of Protestant just craziness, really strict, no fun, Charles comes in. He'd been living in Europe, and he was like, yeah, I like to have fun, right? He restores the theaters, and his favorites were very dirty comedies. Think like the Will Ferrell movies of his day. He restores sporting events, dancing. He actually had what were called drinking clubs, which were basically men just getting around and seeing who could hold off the longest, right? So basically he restores fun. He was also very well known for having some fun with the ladies. These ladies here are all different portraits of just a few of his mistresses. But you know what? Honestly, the people were kind of okay with it because it meant that their king was a real person again. So this is known as the Restoration because they are restoring the monarchy to Europe, right? He actually also had the body of Oliver Cromwell disinterred, so unburied, hanged, and beheaded in 1661 as a sign that he was a traitor. So he was just basically trying to solidify his role as king here in Britain. So when Charles comes to the throne, he's going to try to make it clear that he's actually an absolute monarch. So in 1661, he establishes what's known as the Clarendon Code, which restores Anglicanism, not Protestantism, as the official established religion. In 1673, he imposes stiff penalties on people who don't conform to this. So basically the Puritans, right? So anybody who's not willing to go to the Anglican Church, you're basically screwed, right? So you've got to do that. The next thing that he does is he fights a series of wars with the Dutch Basically, the Dutch and the English both had pretty fabulous navies, and these wars were going to be over who controlled maritime commerce in the 17th century. Newsflash, the English win, spoiler alert, but that's a big deal. And in 1666, actually, there is a fire in London that pretty much destroys 2/3 of the building. Most of the buildings in London are made out of wood. The fire jumps from building to building. It begins in September. There are reports that by March there are still some small fires burning. It demolished the city. We only really have a lot of the details because there was a guy named Samuel Pepys who wrote a lot of diaries at the time, and he really described it. But really, this was a big deal in the city of London, and it was rebuilt by an architect named Sir Christopher Wren, and the city of London as it looks today really is thankful to the redesign under Christopher Wren. It is also in this period that political parties begin to develop. See, Charles is going to die in 1685, right? He has plenty of illegitimate children, but he actually had no legitimate son. And at his death, he converts to Catholicism. Now this makes people a little nervous, as you can imagine. So when he dies in 1685, there are two factions in Parliament who are basically trying to decide who is going to be the heir to the throne. The Tories support Charles II's brother James, who was also a Catholic. The Whigs are basically willing to support anybody else. They just don't want a Catholic monarch. So the first two political parties in England basically form over this division on how we are going to develop or how we are going to find our next king in England, right? So this is a pretty big deal. In the end, however, it is decided that James is going to become king. So in 1685, when his brother dies, James II comes to the throne of England. So here's the problem, right? He's a Catholic, okay? But this is how it kind of worked around this, all right? So James II, first of all, does put some Catholics in power, right? Which does make the England a little nervous. He also has this habit of dissolving Parliament when they objected to anything that he had to do. Sounds a little bit like Dad, right? Remember, the one who got his head cut off? However, they were willing to put up with it because his first wife was a woman named Anne Hyde, and she was a Protestant. And they had two daughters by Anne, Mary and Anne, who were raised as Protestants, right? James was not young, right? He was an old dude, and pretty much, or he was getting up there in years, right? His daughters were grown, and pretty much the English people are like, you know what? We can deal with James as long as we know his heir is a Protestant, right? He's Catholic, we've got it, right? But we know that Mary, who is his heir, is coming after him, and she's Protestant, so we can suck it up and deal with James, right? But remember, Mary is only his heir as long as he has no legitimate sons. Now, Mary actually marries her first cousin, Prince William of Orange, or William III. He is Dutch, and he is a Protestant. That's important. When Anne Hyde dies, however, James marries a Catholic. Mary of Modena, right? Uh-oh. This is a little nervous, right? Parliament starts to bite their nails a little bit. Like, uh-oh. This is bad, right? And it's especially bad when Mary gets pregnant. Because if that child is a boy, he will take Mary's place as the heir. And guess what? It's a boy. James Francis Edward Stewart. Basically now, England's next king is also going to be Catholic. Parliament's not dealing with this. They freak out. Parliament's saying, I'm not having any of it. So this is called the Glorious Revolution. Basically, Parliament writes a letter to Mary and is like, hey Mary, we would love it if you would come to England and be our queen. Bring your husband right? He's in line to the throne anyway. He's through marriage, right? You two can come and co-rule the country as William and Mary, co-monarchs. It'll be great. And we'll just kick your dad off the throne. It's awesome, right? Well, James, at first, he says, no way, I'm not going to do this, right? Until he sees William and Mary's army come marching in, and he flees to France. He gets the nickname the Old Pretender because there will still be people who think that he should rule. But until that point, it's not happening. So this is known as the Glorious Revolution because it is bloodless, right? No battles were fought. Basically, these two guys were just invited into England, and they took the throne all for their own. And it gets a Catholic off the throne. Mary and William are Protestant. Everything's looking pretty good. And in 1689, this was the deal. We'll let you co-rule England, but you have to become a constitutional monarchy, right? You have to, first of all, understand that the monarch's power is limited. You cannot rule without the consent of Parliament. You cannot just get rid of Parliament and dissolve Parliament whenever you need to. And you are going to co-rule with Parliament. We are not having an absolute monarch here in France, right? William and Mary are totally cool with that. They consent to these changes, and sure enough, they become the new monarchs of England. So just some things of the English Bill of Rights. No taxation without the consent of Parliament. That had been the whole thing in the first place. Monarchs cannot suspend Parliament, right? So they can't get rid of any of the laws of Parliament. There is freedom of speech in parliamentary debates, and the citizens are free to petition the monarch whenever they have grievances. So if this looks familiar to you guys, it's because it is actually the basis for our Bill of Rights 100 years later, right? Remember, the American Revolution was descendants of Englishmen. These were the rights they had as English citizens, so these are the rights they're going to want to have as American citizens. So this is something that's really important, okay? They also, in 1701, passed the Act of Settlement, which basically prevents any heirs of James II from ever succeeding the throne, basically his Catholic son, right? They don't want him to come back to the throne. And in 1694, they passed the Triennial Act that says basically Parliament has to meet once every 3 years, right? So they don't have to meet every year, but once every 3 years, they at least have to get together and meet, and that way we can make sure we don't have another one of those periods without Parliament in control. This is also going to establish the cabinet system. Basically, the dilemma at the time, in 1688, is that no monarch can hold the throne without consent of Parliament. However, Parliament also needed the monarch's permission to rule. So the cabinet system is established in the 18th century that basically says the representatives of the major political party, the Tories and the Whigs, remember, form a cabinet. The cabinet is going to work closely, kind of be the go-between between Parliament and the president, or the monarch, right? The leader of the cabinet is what we know as the Prime Minister. So basically that's one guy who is voted on by the cabinet to be the head of state, and the rest of them kind of have to answer to this. Because of this, the Prime Minister and the cabinet are basically the head of the government, and the role of the monarch is now weakened. And in fact, since William and Mary were monarchs, it essentially has weakened to now that the monarch is pretty much a ceremonial head of state rather than a actual ruling leader. So the problem here, of course, is that William and Mary have no children. So when William and Mary are both have passed away by 1702, the next heir is Mary's sister, Anne, who was also the daughter of James II. She is going to be the last monarch of the Stewart Dynasty. So Queen Anne is married to a man named George of Denmark. They actually had gotten pregnant several times, but Anne had some medical issues, and none of those children survived into adulthood or were born stillborn. As I said, she is in constant ill health. Before her death, she becomes incredibly overweight. It's actually said that in the last years of her life, she actually had to be lifted up into her carriage because she couldn't do it on her own. She was also a little bit of a partier. She enjoyed cards and gossips and kind of distractions to get over the fact that she didn't have any children. But she was very much loved as a monarch of England. She really wanted to improve the people's welfare of the country, very liberal-minded, and they loved her for it. She was the last monarch to preside over cabinets and to veto parliamentary legislation. After Anne, Parliament takes much more of a powerful role rather than the monarch. And it is under Anne that England and Scotland are officially united in more than just name, with what is called the Act of Union, and this becomes known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain. So this is really the first time that we're able to use Great Britain as an actual term. Unfortunately, she did not live for very long. She dies on August 1st of 1714, and she is succeeded, because she has no heirs herself, by a German. So her cousin George I was from Hanover, which is in Germany, and he comes to England to take the throne. He speaks no English, he only speaks German, and in fact he did not actually spend most of his time in England. He didn't like England very much. But this is going to be the end of the Stewart Dynasty. They reigned for just a little over 100 years, from 1603 to 1714, and pretty much their entire reign was a series of back and forth civil war. And so this is a really important period of English history, because we do see this shift from this absolute monarchy to this very radical idea of this constitutional monarchy, where the monarch does not have all of the power, but that power goes to the people and to the legislative body. So I hope this gave you a good picture of kind of what was going on in England at this time. When we get back to class, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about constitutionalism, but other than that, I'll see you soon.